Welcome to Making a Meal of It, the podcast for eaters of all appetites who want to reimagine and reinvigorate their relationships with food, food culture, and food systems. I'm David Santo, and today's show sort of returns to the theme of the first episode, as well as the trailer that introduced the podcast in the first place. In this case, I'm naming this theme Eco-gastronomy, what you might call the system of systems of food, including taste and politics and environmentalism and commerce, culture, history, and all the stuff. As you may recall, the expression making a meal of it implies making something overly important. But once again, I say, why not make food as important as it can be? It is, after all, everything. So this episode is meant to illustrate that, with just one slightly longer than usual conversation about the and of it all. If you listened to the very mini episode I posted last week, you'll already know that I had to pivot on this episode, having found out the other conversation I'd recorded couldn't be used. I'll get into that in a minute, but first, have a listen to this. That was the sound of words and meaning, as well as time passing and things changing. It was, in fact, me flipping through my copy of La Physiologie du goût, or The Physiology of Taste, the book written by the French gastronome Jean-Antoine Brillat-Savarin and translated by the great American food writer M.F.K. Fisher. It was then also the sound of me dropping the book on the floor and moving on to another, more contemporary set of ideas about food. Brillat-Savarin is often referred to as the grandfather of gastronomy, having written his big book in 1825 and having had a really good publisher who kept it in print since then, including in many translations. Gastronomy is a word that was probably first used in ancient Greece, but came back into modern usage in 1801 when a French poet named Joseph Berchoux used the word gastronome to describe a person from the countryside with deep knowledge of fine food products. Etymologically, however, gastronomy means basically the rules of the stomach or the written word of the stomach, despite all the current connotations of fanciness or refined or expensive food. I like the idea of the rules of the stomach because it evokes all of the different pathways and requirements and processes that food takes to get into our bodies. And that's kind of everything. All it is society and nature and language and science and the senses and abstraction and art and. Personally, I'm not that huge a fan of Brillat-Savarin's book, and I get a little tired of people pointing to it as the definitive source on gastronomy. It was, after all, written about 100 years ago by a single, highly privileged man in France. His time and his credentials were very specific to him and his position in society at that time, and his perspectives on food were just that, those of one person. Most importantly, a huge number of things have changed since the early 19th century in France, and so the concept of gastronomy needs to evolve to be meaningful to contemporary society. And it is evolving, though sometimes it feels like global politics and economic realities are kind of putting the brakes on gastronomy's forward momentum. Gastronomy, or eco-gastronomy in fact, was the focus of my own PhD work in food some years ago. I'd come back to Montreal after doing my master's degree in Italy at the University of Gastronomic Sciences, the school founded by Slow Food International to train a new generation of food folks. The master was multidisciplinary and multi-experiential in the extreme. Tasting workshops took place next to anthropology and sociology courses, and field trips included writing and photography lessons. We'd study wine and olive oil production technologies and then go visit vineyards and olive mills to see them in action. We learned about the biochemical science of stressed pigs just before a lunch of prosciutto and pig snout stew. We imagined ways of changing food systems and did thesis projects with activists and farmers and pastry chefs. It was a full mind, body, psyche experience. It was eco-gastronomy. When I started my doctoral work, I wanted to continue that kind of holistic approach to food because I found it so personally transformational, and I wanted to see whether there'd be space for it in more conventional academic circles. There was, and there wasn't. My degree didn't end up translating into a full-time professor job somewhere, but that really wasn't my goal after all. What did happen was that I got to contribute to a bunch of other eco-gastronomic projects, including food studies programs here in Montreal, in Edinburgh, in Melbourne, and in Toronto, as well as at my old home university in Italy. I've gotten to do some really satisfying and I think productive work in the field, and I've met and collaborated with lots of amazing people and projects. This podcast is one of the outcomes of all those relationships. Unfortunately, over the last couple of years, I'm sensing that some of the energy behind the idea or the work of eco-gastronomy is kind of fading. At least 3 university programs with gastronomy in their titles have been or will soon be shutting down. And even my old alma mater in Italy seems to have shifted from a generalist format of food scholarship to a more, tactical one. University programs have to justify their existence, showing graduate profiles that are definable within standardized terminology and specialist professions. The problem is eco-gastronomy and food is generalist and complex. And that's exactly how we need to think about and practice it, but it doesn't fit into most measurement standards. And so sometimes things shut down. To me, that seems to be what has happened to l'Office Montréalais de la Gastronomie, the Montreal Office of Gastronomy. 3 years ago, this brilliant initiative was announced by the Mayor of Montreal. It was an effort to make the city known as an international capital of food. The office and its programs addressed food education and production and transformation, research, media, funding for chefs to travel and show off our culture, and of course also promotion for the city and its restaurants as a food tourism destination. This incredibly comprehensive dossier had been developed very carefully over about 10 years by the incredibly dedicated and brilliant Stéphanie Laurin, who then became the director of the office. Stéphanie would have been the second person I talked to on this episode, but a couple of weeks ago I learned that the whole project has now been shut down and Stéphanie is no longer there. It is really too bad. A quick conversation with the head of PR for Tourism Montreal confirmed that food is now being woven into other programs and projects there, but there's no longer a dedicated office focusing on it in a generalist and complex way. So as I try to remain hopeful, and if I follow the patterns of other dynamic ecologies, then I have to acknowledge that over time, some parts of eco-gastronomic systems need to die and decompose so that new foodish entities can emerge. Things evolve. It's just a bummer when a few really great steps forward for a field of study or an ideological movement or a bunch of professional practices all seem to be, in vain. We'll see what happens over time, and I will continue to try to think and act eco-gastronomically in my own work, even if sometimes it feels like the world is resistant to such longer-term efforts. Although we won't be hearing from Stéphanie Laurin today, I do have a pretty great conversation about how food can play out in the context of nation building and the reinvigoration of cultural pride and collective wellness and nutritional and economic sovereignty. For the Stick This in Your Mouth segment, Maxime and I focus on what might be the most important edible worldwide. Stay tuned. And closing out the episode, we have a Food Questionnaire respondent who looks to both the past and the present for personal and literary inspiration. All this I offer under the umbrella of eco-gastronomy, the system of systems of food, the space where the rules of the stomach, the complexities of eating, and the sensory connections between matter and meaning all come together in a delightful set of relationships. Up first is a conversation with Mark Panayiotis Notaras, the Greek-Australian co-founder of the Timor-Leste Food Lab, social enterprise, and its flagship restaurant, Agora Food Studio. Mark has focused his career on international development and peacebuilding in South-East Asia and Timor-Leste in particular. Since returning to Australia in 2020, he's worked as general manager for the multicultural marketing agency CulturalPulse, leading the strategy in multicultural fan engagement for the recent FIFA Women's World Cup. So, Mark, thank you so much for being part of the podcast. Thank you for getting up early in the morning Australia time to join me in this conversation.
Thanks for having me on your wonderful podcast, David, and greetings to Montreal from sunny Sydney.
Yes, well, other end of the world from Montreal. And we welcome the sun. We're not having so much of it here these days. But when you and I first met, we were actually not living in Sydney, but in the South-East Asian nation of Timor-Leste. And you were doing international development work there. It was an amazing series of projects that you had going on with Agora Food Studio and other branches of your professional life. But can you tell me just how you actually ended up being in Timor at that point?
My reason for being in Timor probably goes back to my childhood, where I was exposed to my dad's slides of my parents' exotic adventures in South Asia, East Asia, the Mediterranean. And I just was aware from a young age that there was a wider world beyond the island continent of Australia. And also, in addition to that, my parents being quite aware of social justice issues. And I just had this feeling that I wanted to be, from a young age, overseas, doing things in the world that were making a difference. So that led me at university to study international relations, international affairs, and study about parts of the world where people's lives were impacted by poverty and conflict. And that led me into a career in the bureaucracy around international aid with AusAid, the Australian Agency for International Development, and later to the United Nations University, which was the think tank of the United Nations in Japan. However, after several years of working in aid, but working in conferences and on research papers that probably nobody actually ever read. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this meme.
Oh, I've heard of that. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I felt some level of, I would say, imposter syndrome, in the sense that I was writing about places that I really was passionate about and interested in, but without the credibility of having the in-country or in the field, as we say, experience. And one of those places that I'd written about was Timor. And it was that time in my career where I really needed to get grounded, go into the field and be part of, the communities that are directly experiencing the poverty and conflict that I was writing about and talking about.
Well, and Timor has had such an incredibly complex history of poverty, of conflict, of colonialization, of exploitation, of all sorts of countries invading, occupying, possessing it, and really doing damage over the long haul. And the work you were doing there when we first met was around food. Can you tell me why food was so important and so central to the work that you're doing there?
Yeah, it's a really complex question because there are so many, as you know, and you've written about, there are so many variables that play into the food system. But in a nutshell, I think it's because as a small Southeast Asian island nation that's very import dependent, there's actually an opportunity for countries like Timor and in the Pacific to grow more of their own food. But the importation of food has impacts on the economy, inflationary impacts. It has impacts on the environment, where you've got a lot of fallow agriculture. And then it also has impacts on the population, because young people are not engaged in the agricultural sector. They go and leave and they work in factories and low-paying jobs abroad. And so there's an opportunity there for people to grow more nutritious food. I should also say malnutrition being the second worst in the world in Timor. Yet, people are not consuming high nutritious fruits and vegetables that they could grow around them. So I moved out of the peace building and post-conflict kind of space into the agriculture training space because of my passion for food. And it made sense at the time. This is around 2010 to 2015, because Timor-Leste itself was moving from a post-conflict phase into a development phase. Yeah, plus it's amazing to be able to grow your own food, isn't it? And experience that, the fingers in the dirt kind of experience that I was able to have there as well.
And it's an experience, but it's also, it's a really important way to redevelop a relationship with one's place. It's an incredibly important part of attaining sovereignty, both in the food realm and the political realm. It's a way to regain an identity, which had presumably been, if not lost, really, really rattled over years and years of conflict and war and violence. It was only in 2002 that Timor became its own independent self, right? It became a nation in 2002. Is that right?
That's right. After 500 years of colonial occupation, firstly and mostly by the Portuguese, who stripped the land of most of its valuable resources, and then over 20 years of illegal occupation by the Indonesian state. So they've only been, as a country, independent for 20 years to be able to determine their own sovereignty and direction, like you said.
And so contributing to that nation building process through food is what you were basically doing there.
That's right. And working with communities to be able to have the nutrition that they needed to access close to them, firstly.
Mm-hmm.
And then secondly, helping communities transition from purely subsistence agriculture, which can be quite brutal and punishing, particularly for school kids who are engaged all day in agriculture or watering crops, little inputs of technology that don't make communities dependent, but can actually take them to be able to earn income from agriculture, send kids to school, and at the same time have more nutrition available and accessible. One of the challenges that we faced, however, was that even if people grew a lot of nutritious vegetables, let's say leafy green vegetables and other fortifying foods, they might sell it all and not give it to their kids. So the important point there being that the nutrition element and then the agriculture business element have to come together.
And eating food from their own place. I mean, Timor, as you told me, is an incredibly agriculturally biodiverse place. There is tons of different foods. When I was there with you, I was seeing, 3 different kinds of passion fruit sitting at the market stands, and all of these peppers and tomatoes and many things from different countries, but also many, many indigenous species and varieties that were incredibly interesting and delicious, but had kind of fallen out of, if not favor, out of practice among the Timorese themselves. And so when we met, you were talking about sort of revalorizing that incredible food heritage, making it interesting not only to grow, but to eat the food of Timor, to address malnutrition, to address economic sovereignty, to address identity and culture, and that whole bigger process of nation building. As you know, I was blown away by the experience, and I've never witnessed something so powerful in terms of bringing everything together that is good through food.
Yeah, well, I'll just add to that briefly, David, some context for your listeners. The reason a lot of the indigenous foods had actually remained, although they were slowly being lost, the traditional knowledge, like everywhere, is being lost. But the reason they remained partly was because of conflict, and the unfortunate element of conflict being that people couldn't access food easily. And so they became very creative with what they had. They went back to things that they knew that were either wild and foraged foods. Hyper seasonality is really important there. So you saw fruits and leaves and fungi that might come for 2 weeks of the year and then disappear. Well, the Timorese had a language and a way to process those and prepare those that is probably not available in the neighboring Indonesian islands. And so that's where the rich food storytelling history that you were involved in came from in Timor. And I think what my partner and I at the time saw was an opportunity to utilize these resources that are often growing wild but are not being taken up as an economic resource for particularly the internationals living in the country who were eating out, spending most of their income eating out and being entertained on 100% foreign food often. So chickens from Brazil, Timor's a rice-growing country, but rice was from Vietnam, beef is from Australia. So you can imagine you're eating out in Timor, there's all this wild food growing around you just behind the restaurant in a sort of an urban forest area, yet on the plate everything is imported and it doesn't taste great, let's be honest. These frozen foods that come 14,000 kilometers across from Brazil to Timor. So we saw an opportunity and we were excited by the opportunity of using more local foods on the plate and creating an economic opportunity out of that for local communities at the same time.
And so tell me, how did you do that? Through cooking for foreign nationals? Through talking to Timorese themselves? Through what were the ways of getting this change to happen?
Well, you were part of the story, David. I recall, your links and our links to slow food was what really kicked it off. Being aware of this international slow food movement, which was trying to valorize and protect foods of certain denomination around the world that had traditional preparations that were local foods, often took time to produce, but, were high in flavor and had great heritage and also protected culture. So before we started the Timor-Leste Food Lab social enterprise and our flagship restaurant, Agora Food Studio, we were involved in slow food activities that we created along with some Timorese chefs in the country, more like pop-up events, tasting events around not only food, but also coffee, and then the food storytelling event that we did with you back in 2015. And this precipitated the idea that there was an opportunity in the capital city, Dili, to reach, at that time, a mostly international market who were hungry for something a little bit more local, but that was presented in a way that they could understand, that was safe in terms of the food preparation and maybe a little bit sexy and exotic in terms of the taste and they weren't accessing that at the time. So slow food, in a way, was a testing ground for us to try ideas, which eventuated in a restaurant which was attempting to do 100% local food in a country that was importing 70% of its food.
Wow. The numbers are really sort of horrifying and depressing. But what you did was the opposite. It was incredibly joyous. I remember being there and just thinking, well, one, the food was unbelievably good and tastes that I never thought I would even encounter. I still remember the budu, the fermented pickles and the fermented chili sauces that were just sent me over the moon. But all the food and the colors and the diversity was really what struck me so strongly. So Agora, which you founded way back when, and which has now transitioned into local ownership, is that correct? That you've made it possible for the team who is still working in Timor to be their own bosses. You help them learn how to be the bosses, and then you transition the ownership over to them. So it gets away from the idea of what sometimes the accusations of white saviorship are really problematic. You are no longer in Timor, but the work is still there and the people are still there, and it's now actually owned and operated by that team. How did that transition process come into your mind and then actually happen?
It's a long story, so I'll do my best to keep it truncated. But look, I'd say that, my then partner, Alva, and I both came from the aid space, where the objective when you're working in post-conflict and developing countries is you don't stay too long. You're trying to do yourself out of the job. That's the theory. We know that doesn't always happen and people get stuck and then they need the job more than the country needs them. We were very conscious of this when we started a social enterprise for the first time. And although we were passionate food lovers and great cooks, we weren't chefs and we'd never run a food business before. So we had a few advantages there in the sense that we weren't hooked into a business model that made sense in Australia or Canada or anywhere else. It was always our intention from the start to hand over. So we were, I would say, practiced in the art of delegation from the start, which is a business philosophy and also monkey management from the Harvard Business School Review 1973. If you want to read it, I highly recommend this paper to anyone who works anywhere and is a control freak. So, applying the art of delegation from early on and understanding that people need to grow in jobs really quickly, keep motivation high, and also you as a founder or a proprietor need to grow as well. And Alva and I wanted to grow our own skills. So we didn't want to be in the kitchen and on service all the time like we were for the first 6 to 12 months, for example. With that in mind, we also didn't bring the indigenous knowledge around the food. We didn't know what the ingredients were called and how they were prepared. So from the very start, the collaboration was very real in terms of us bringing our acumen around management and the international lens about what an international customer in Dili would like to consume and how good service is positioned. But from the point of view of our Timorese colleagues, they had all the knowledge around the food. Mm-hmm. And this was hopefully a beautiful marriage to, cross-culturally to bring our different views together. But the emergency of COVID basically accelerated this delegative structure that we put in place, in the sense that we decided in difficult circumstances in 2020 to leave Timor. And then that really forced and gave a great challenge to our local team to manage things. So having founded it in 2016, maybe we would have left a couple of years later, but as it turned out, this was accelerated. And what was amazing was our team really stood up and they were in a way pressured to deliver more themselves without us there. And we consciously pulled back. We started off as managers. We morphed into being mentors, and we finished the process, the 7-year process, as being coaches. And they're very different things. And I'm really proud to say Paula, Alu, Kelor, Eulalia, Anna, shout out to the gang. They've taken it on this year, and it's their first business, and they've worked together for several years. So they've already got a good chemistry and a balance between, we've got great chefs in our team. We've got great finance and other managers, and we've got people that work in marketing and know how to do good service. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be able to say that I'm no longer involved. However, I do keep an eye on how things are going, and I do send the odd customer up to Dili and make sure that the income is ticking over at Agora.
Good. It was a beautiful place to be, and they've moved spaces, right? But they are still running strong, and the reviews are great, and the food is fabulous.
Yeah, I'd say they moved space to a new space, and there was a lot of trepidation at the time around that. and people don't generally like change, but I would advise anyone out there thinking of doing the same thing, you need to move space. You need to move a social enterprise to a new location so that people who are taking that over, the local people, they have 100% ownership of that new concept and that new design. And the old space was Mark and Alva's space regardless. And the new space, I've got nothing to do with it. I didn't see it. I wasn't involved in designing or selecting it. So it's theirs to own and carry forward.
So now that you are back in Australia, do you think of food as complex? Do you think of it, did you used to think of it as complex and now it's just a little less complex? How's your perception of it as a system changed through your work then and your work now?
It's a great question. There's no doubt food is complex. However, we do complicate it. We're very susceptible to the latest fads and trends in dieting, for example. There's a new one every 2 years. Interestingly, in the West, people are obsessed with organic. In Timor, everything was organic because they couldn't yet afford fertilizer inputs. They would never use the word organic. Yeah, we too tend to do analysis paralysis on food. I think sometimes the fact that it is complicated and you make a very complicated curry, for example, that's very layered is great. But other times, just the freshest of bread and the height of summer tomatoes is where this simplicity really speaks through, and that's what I think the beauty's in the simplicity is in a way.
And so again, now that you're home, or now that you're in Sydney anyway, what parts of Timor-Leste are still in your heart or in your mind?
I think from going there yourself the beauty of the mountains, the unspoilt nature of a lot of the environment, in the sense that Timor hadn't been industrialized. You don't see industrial pollution everywhere. There was no factories and ugly hydro schemes and that sort of things. And being in the coffee forest, where it's reasonably untouched, but there's communities living in and around that with the biodiversity, and the altitude there is where a lot of people find their home in Timor. And the second part for me would be, at the end of the day, after 8 years there, a handful of people who I worked with for a long period of time who, you're in the trenches with in the kitchen or on service or doing our nutrition projects for a long period of time. And you build these bonds with those 5 people that I mentioned who are currently owners. So my ongoing relationship with Timor is more as an observer, but I would intend to go back yearly, visit Agora, have a great cup of coffee from Erimera district and have a meal of 100% Timorese food, including those beautiful pickles that you mentioned.
Oh, the pickles. Well, and the kumbili, the giant lesser yam that measured whatever it was, 3 feet long that you could buy in the market pre-roasted. That is the taste that I forever retain from Timor, is that combination of that sort of fluffy tuber roasted potato thing that I could never even describe properly, but that with some Timorese pickle. So good.
What you're invoking there, David, of course, is the link between memory and smell.
Yeah.
And which I'm sure you've written about, but I actually would add another thing that I really miss, which is, this trend in Australia or Canada, cooking with fire or cooking on wood. It's like in Timor, people are doing that. That's their daily life.
Yeah. And,
whether it's coconut wood or different other teak or whatever they're using, the eucalyptus, they're preparing food and they're wrapping it in banana leaf and they're preparing it in bamboo, and they're doing really interesting things with fish and meat, the smoked yams that you mentioned. So that's another thing I really miss, because that's a flavor sensation and a smell that you just cannot get outside of Timor and maybe other South-East Asian countries.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. So what are you eating these days?
I think I may have mentioned to you, as a child, I was force-fed Greek food by my 2 yayas. And so I kind of do build my way of eating around the Greek diet. I won't say the Mediterranean diet because it's a little cliched, but by that what I mean is a diet that is quite hearty. We have a lot of vegetables that are cooked for a long period of time, a lot of beans, a lot of dips, and a lot of different flavors and colors come together around whole foods. I do eat meat occasionally, but not a lot, and I love my seafood. But it's a Greek-influenced diet with really good olive oil, great bread, and I basically will experiment as I go with whatever ingredient is in season. But I love my food, and my cooking is my happy place. I don't get stressed cooking, and I sort of, after a big day at work, and it's just, you put the headphones on, dance to some your latest Taylor Swift song or whatever, and just cook and be in my happy place. And And but the Greek food will always be a part of me. I've got into olive and olive oil tasting since I've got back into Australia as well. So that's a little touch point that I have in the food industry here.
The image of you dancing around the kitchen to Taylor Swift, I may not retain for a long time, but you coming back to your heritage and your Greek food makes me very happy. It is wonderful to eat of one's own identity and feel that sense of reinforcement coming from within. Mark, I don't know what to say, but thank you so much for sharing these stories. Thank you for introducing me to Timor in the first place. It is a place that I will always remember.
Thanks to you, David, for being such an important part of our collective journey in setting up the Timor-Leste Food Lab. And one important point of advice you gave me, you may remember back in 2015, was when we were grappling with how to set up slow food in Timor-Leste and then take that forward. One important point you made to me was it wasn't about having an organisation and membership and the procedures around slow food, but it was really about embodying the spirit of slow food in what you're doing, even if there's not an institutional architecture around that. And Alva and I certainly took on your advice and applied that through the Agora Food Studio restaurant and made it our own and made it something that Timor can own that wasn't caught up in an international bureaucratic movement. So I really appreciate that advice. That really opened up my mind to the importance of doing things rather than talking about things and having things structured in a particular way.
Well, that's very gratifying to know. If I was a facilitator of an idea, so much the better, but you guys certainly ran with it.
Thanks, David.
And take a look at the show notes for links to Agora and the Timor-Leste Food Lab, as well as the podcast that Mark executive produces called Statecraftiness. There's even an episode called Foodcraftiness, all about using food in statecraft, which includes more stories about Timor-Leste. Look for episode 2 of season 2 of Statecraftiness to listen. Well, hi, Maxime. Are you ready to taste possibly the most important food on the planet?
Yes, but what is it?
Well, what do you think is the most important food?
Chips?
No. You're close, though.
Candy?
Nope. That's the other direction.
Protein?
That's not a food.
Oh.
That's a nutrient.
Okay.
It's salt.
Salt?
Yes, because salt makes everything taste better.
That is true.
And historically, it was not just important, it was also incredibly expensive because it was so hard to come by. It was worth its weight in gold. In fact, it was more valuable than gold.
That I knew.
But it's an incredibly important preservation agent. It's critical in fermentation. And of course, it does make things taste better. But for a long time, it was just very, very hard to come by because you need to make it either by mining it out of a mountain in the Himalayas, which is running out, but not quickly, or evaporating it, or boiling it down in some way so that you can extract it from seawater. So it's not really easy to come by unless you have the technology.
Mm-hmm.
Do you like salt tastes?
I do. And I like the effect it has on food when you cook it. It just seems to bring the flavors forward.
Yes, it supposedly helps sweet things taste a little bit sweeter and rounder. And then in higher concentrations, it can help things with umami taste even richer and more savory in the mouth. So it sort of works in a bunch of different ways. And of course, it helps water boil at a higher temperature, and it helps make ice cream because you can reduce the freezing temperature of the ice when you're using ice to make ice cream. So it's really incredibly functional and super common on the planet, but not super accessible until our technology caught up.
Very interesting.
Yes, I'm just full of facts learned from the internet, most likely. So maybe they're true. So today we're going to taste a couple of salts because in this day and age, everything's gotten fancy and salt has got its normal version that you use for boiling pasta. And salt's got its fancy versions that you use for finishing dishes. Sometimes they have super crystalline structures that you can see. I mean, all salt has a crystalline structure, like the salts we've got in front of us, are very geometric and cute and cool and fun. One of them's black, one of them's white.
Yes.
And the black one is from Cyprus. You brought it into our household, and you never really used it very much. And we still have it.
The story goes, you try a recipe that recommends it. and you buy it because you think it's important and that you're going to be using it, and then you don't.
Yeah, and I don't think I've ever even tried it. It's been on our spice shelf for 3 years.
So then let's take a taste.
Okay, well, why don't you dive in? It's very cool looking. It's black like charcoal.
Yeah.
And it's got a cool pyramidal shape.
Yeah.
And it's crunchy.
It's also very, very impressive with light-colored food.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, it's partly the look, but I'm tasting sort of charcoal.
Yep.
It's beautiful close up.
Yep, it is.
It looks like a ziggurat. Wow, it's super salty. Minerally.
Mm-hmm.
Quite yummy. We should be using it. Okay. Well, let's try this one next to it, which is salt that we bought on the lower north shore of Quebec. St. Lawrence River salt.
Yes. Which was a discovery.
Yeah, I didn't know we made salt in Quebec.
I didn't know we either.
Ooh. What do you think of that one?
It's even saltier than the black one.
Yeah, it's intense.
It's really intense.
Do you have other taste sensations going on?
No, the salt is kind of overpowering everything else.
Mm-hmm.
Are you tasting something?
It's almost burning.
Mm-hmm.
It's very, very salty.
Yeah, which is surprising because you don't think that the St. Lawrence River has a salty body of water.
It's all that beluga urine. Sorry. I'm going to have to put in the show notes that there's some rough language in this episode.
Yes.
So salt has been so central to our human culture for so long that it's entered into the lexicon as well. You know that the word salary comes from salt?
I did not know that.
Salary, salaire. It was how people were paid. They were paid in salt because it was so valuable that it took the form of currency. Salad means basically salted vegetables or salted anything. So you could have a salad of meat, a salad of cheese, a salad of vegetables. And then there are all these expressions like the salt of the earth or he's worth his weight in salt.
Or also don't be so salty.
Don't be so salty, which is referring to rough language spoken by people down at the dockside.
Mm-hmm.
Are there expressions in French that refer to salt? Sel.
Un grain de sel. Add your grain de sel to the conversation.
Oh, okay. Your 2 cents.
Your 2 cents. Exactly.
All right, so now we're going to try something else that is related to salt, but not salt. So sort of equally important in the gastronomy world. Mm-hmm. So we have a fish sauce, some nuoc mam, and soy sauce, a light soy sauce. Mm-hmm. So you want to taste one and I'll taste the other?
Cheers.
Cheers. I don't know which one you got. Ooh.
I think I have the soy sauce.
Yes, I have the fish sauce. It's actually kind of yummy. This is a really nice fish sauce.
It's such an interesting product.
Soy?
Soy, because it has this very particular taste on top of being salty. Mm-hmm. And it just flavors all types of foods in such an interesting way.
Yeah. Both of these sauces are fermented sauces. So fish sauce is salted fish that's then left to ferment, not rot, but, exude delicious juices. And similarly, soybeans that are used in soy sauce. Mm-hmm. But that additional umami taste from the fermentation really goes nicely with the saltiness.
It's very rounded as a flavor. Mm-hmm. It's surprising because sometimes you smell fish sauce and it's very pungent. And this one is not as much.
Well, and it's so interesting, right? Because MSG is used so much around the world to do exactly that same thing, to give a kind of salty umami taste. For some people, it's not so good in their bodies. And when I was working in Timor-Leste, the people I was working with there were actually organizing salt tasting workshops because Timor has the opportunity to produce a lot of salt. And there's some very delicious salts that are produced in and around Timor, except over its last number of decades of history and the imposition of other food cultures on the Timorese, MSG became more popular as a flavoring agent. And so they're trying to go back to taste old flavors of Timor, including the salt that had been produced there through evaporation for many, many, many generations.
Wow, that's very interesting. Mm-hmm. I did not know that.
Salt tasting workshop.
Who knew?
All right, I have one final taste for you. And it's because you've been such a willing participant in all these stick this in your mouths. So this is a kind of reward. The last salty taste that we've got for you is...
Oh my God, listener, I love chips.
And these are plain Lay's potato chips. Mm-hmm. The very best. They're just like a vector for salt, right?
Absolutely.
Well, and oil. And a little bit of potato flavor.
Yep.
Here, there's a bowl full.
Thank you.
Bon appetit.
Thank you.
I do realize how privileged I am to work in a field like food and to have had a truly extraordinary set of experiences in many a gastronomic context. The people I know and continue to meet, including through this podcast, are a really wonderful bunch of change-oriented thinkers and doers. I also realize that in times like these, when political and climatic and economic and social crises are all running into each other, we humans tend to duck and cover, taking care of immediate needs like hunger and shelter and security. So it's kind of normal that some longer-term visions for foundational change to our food systems, like those offered by eco-gastronomy, might falter or go away, either for a while or forever. And I also know that a few university programs being shut down or an office of gastronomy being sunsetted is not the end of an idea or an era, it's just part of the ongoing evolution of things. Though even as I declare that gastronomy is dead, long live gastronomy, eco-gastronomy does indeed live on. It continues within the minds and bodies of the many alumni and educators and administrators of all those programs and projects. It continues in the hearts and hands of artisans and statecrafters and poets, and perhaps it takes a new form in other languages and knowledge systems, all the ways we have of understanding the planet and our people and their food. We are all eaters, after all, and the rules of our stomachs are not going away. Rounding out this requiem and celebration of eco-gastronomy is the Making a Meal of It Food Questionnaire. This week we hear from Taras Grescoe, a Canadian non-fiction writer who is the author of several books, including Bottom Feeder, How to Eat Ethically in a World of Vanishing Seafood, and Strap Hanger, Saving Our Cities and Ourselves from the Automobile. Most recently, he published The Lost Supper, Searching for the Future of Food in the Flavors of the Past. On the day we recorded his responses, Taras described himself as chilled, well-fed, and hungry for more. Taras, what is your idea of a perfect food?
The dumpling in its many forms, from the pierogi to the jiaozi.
Of what food or food context are you afraid or distrustful?
Just about anything that is meant to be put in a microwave.
What word or concept describes a well-balanced food system?
2 words, or one with a hyphen: soil health.
What word or concept describes why food systems often remain unbalanced?
The Haber-Bosch process, by which we make artificial synthetic fertilizers.
Which food person do you most admire?
A fellow called Apicius. This was the man who inspired the cookbook of the same name. He hired a ship to take him to North Africa to confirm whether prawns there were better than those in his native Campania.
Which food innovation do you try to ignore?
Lab-grown meat.
What is your greatest gastronomic extravagance?
Thin slices of acorn-fed ham from Spain, which I have maybe 5 or 6 times a year.
For what do you hunger?
All that I haven't tasted yet.
What do you consider to be an overrated food or food context?
Never-ending tasting menus.
On what occasion do you feign satiety?
The potlucks at my children's school happened last night.
What do you most dislike about dinner tables?
There's sometimes wobbly legs.
What is the quality you most like in a fruit?
Passion. I'm currently obsessed by those aromatic purple eggs.
What is the quality you most like in a cut of meat?
Its thinness. Indeed, its translucency. Once again, I'm referring to Spanish ham.
Which condiments do you most overuse?
Nuoc mam, the Vietnamese fish sauce, or my own version of homemade garum.
Which culinary skill would you most like to have?
I would really like to know how to make a truly top-notch bouillabaisse.
What do you consider your greatest edible achievement?
Grinding the ancient grain emmer on a metate, a Mexican grindstone, then baking it in a firin, which is a Turkish clay oven, to recreate Neolithic flatbread as it was eaten 8,000 years ago.
If you were to die and come back as an edible animal, vegetable, or mineral, what would you like it to be?
I have a temperamental alignment with horses. I would come back as a horse, but I would have to remind myself to stay out of Belgium.
Where and or when would you most like to dine?
I would pay a fortune to have a simple meal at the Thermopolium, the recently excavated restaurant in Pompeii. However, not on August 24th in the year 79.
What is your most treasured kitchen implement?
An exquisite and really inexpensive handheld spice grinder I got at the Grand Bazaar in Istanbul.
What is your favorite highly processed food?
All right, I've been known to eat a Cheeto, maybe 3 Cheetos.
What is your favorite aroma?
That would be garlic, frying in olive oil, scented outdoors in a street around 5:30 p.m.
Who are your favorite food writers?
That varies from month to month and year to year. The ones I come back to are Alan Davidson, Bill Buford, Rabelais, and I have to add Brillat Savarin.
Who are your favorite food celebrities?
Top of the list, Sally Granger, the Julia Child of ancient Roman cookery.
With which cuisine do you most identify?
It's gotta be Ukrainian. I have an Irish side, but it's rather underdeveloped, at least gastronomically.
What is your most powerful sense?
It's no longer my vision. My night vision is going, so it's gotta be smell.
What are your favorite agricultural, culinary, or gastronomic words?
Tasty, farmhouse, esculent.
What would you eat as your second to last meal?
I'd go for a multi-course Roman Jewish meal, from artichokes to fiori di zucca, washed down with lots of frescati in Rome.
What food-related epitaph would you put on your own tombstone?
He ate slow and died old.
What question would you either add to this questionnaire or like to ask me?
Where do you get the nerve, sir? Tell me.
And that wraps it up for this episode of Making a Meal of It. Thank you so much to Mark Panayiotis Notaras, Maxime Giroux, and Taras Grescoe, as well as Stephanie Laurent for her efforts in making gastronomy into a municipal function, at least for a while. Your legacy lives on. And of course, my gratitude goes out to all those of you who think and do food every day, whether or not you call yourselves gastronomes. For news and updates, check out makingamealofit.com or follow us at Making a Meal Podcast on most social media platforms. And let me know what you are growing, preserving, cooking, and serving. Reserve your table now for the next episode as we stir the pot a bit on restaurants. I'll be talking with 2 experts, one a cook and one a researcher, about the complexities of restaurant spaces and relationships, including the many ways in which they can be both highly creative as well as remarkably toxic. And noisy, too. What is it with restaurant noise levels? Join us, won't you? In the meantime, as so many have said before, eat schmacklich and auf Wiedersehen.